You're listening to Mark of the Maker. Hey everybody, I'm Mark Steiner and you're listening to Mark of the Maker. This is episode 73 of the show. We're going to get into kind of a history, I guess it's safe to call this a history episode. We'll explain exactly what we're going to do here in just a couple minutes. Let's make sure we have the whole usual crew here with us. I think we got a full house today. We have Mr. Michael Birch.
Here.
We have Mr. Sean Kendrick.
Hey.
And we have Mr. Tom Crine.
Hello.
So yeah, we have everybody here this time, which is cool. Kind of our usual panel of folks. We do have a special guest with us that's subject matter expert on what we're going to talk about, but let's take care of a little business first, Tom.
I want to recommend American Metal Exchange for all your titanium, zirc, Damasteel, Mokume needs. George is a good friend of the show, and he's got a lot of good stuff over there. So amxinc.com. And once again, that's amxinc.com.
Yeah, the show would not be possible without George's support. So let's kind of talk a little bit about what we're going to do. We're going to call this episode Switchblades and BB Guns, which I think has a fun ring to it. And our special guest this time, if you remember, in our episode about Boker, we had a gentleman with us named Neil Punchard, and Neil has written some books on both of these topics, what we thought were really cool, and we wanted to have Neil back to talk to us about them. So welcome back to Mark of the Maker, Neil.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here.
Glad you're here.
Yeah, good to have you again.
Yeah. So you wrote books on both of these things, Neil. Let's talk first about what the names of the books are so people know where to go find them.
Well, the first book I wrote was Daisy BB Guns, and that was written back in 2002. I'm a collector. I've always been a collector, and when I was collecting some Daisy BB Guns since being a youth, I started looking around going, man, I should get a book on this. And I looked, and there were no books on Daisy BB Guns.
Right.
So I thought, well, if there isn't a book, maybe I should just write one. And I had no idea what it took to write a book. So I called up a few buddies of mine that were kind of heavy into the graphic arts and photography and said, hey, would you guys help me do a book? And they said, absolutely. So I pounded away. It was 2002, so it was right about the time when the internet was just starting, but pretty much all my information was gotten through other publications and print ads and library and old-fashioned sources. And it was fun. We put this book together, and I had it published through a book company, and it did very well and sold a ton of books. So it was kind of fun. That was my first foray into the book world.
Nice. And not like some kind of tricky title, just straight up Daisy BB Guns. If people
was
Daisy,
the first 100 years.
Okay.
And it was more of a coffee table book. It actually won an award for design and layout. It wasn't an encyclopedia so much as it was a nice showcase. So it kind of goes through and shows the BB rifles that Daisy had, the pistols. And then beyond that, Daisy had so many cool toys. I mean, they had pop guns and squirt guns, metal squirt guns dating back to the early 1900s. And then cool names like the Zuka pop pistol. Buck Jones and Buzz Barton and all these great names that,
wow,
long before we were all born, but, just really cool stuff. And beyond anything else, Daisy was just such a marketing giant. I mean, a lot of people can come up with a good product or a good idea, but that's only half the battle. The other half is, do you have the wherewithal to promote your product, to push it, to get it out there? And that's what Daisy did, man. They built a great product, and then they marketed the heck out of it. So it was just,
Very
cool. It was so fun to read the history of Daisy and to find out not only how they produce the stuff, but how they went about marketing it. It was just great.
Yeah. Well, let's do this. Well, we'll start with Switchblades.
Sure.
Because I think that's, we're kind of officially a knife show and all that.
Absolutely.
But then we'll save BB guns for dessert. That's the way Michael would say it. And
that sounds
I like
good.
that idea. So, because secretly we really want to all geek out on BB guns. We're all dorks for that kind of stuff. So, but we'll start with knives. So let's start there. So Switchblades.
Okay. So beyond a BB gun, what early teenage kid doesn't want a switchblade knife? When I was about 14 years old, my parents took a trip to Mexico. My brother, sister, my mom and dad, and we went to the usual, places, Mexico City, and just bopped around down there. And one of the first tourist stands, lo and behold, there's a guy selling switchblades. Well, I'd always had a pocket knife. My dad always had a pocket knife, but I'd never seen a switchblade. And here are these phenomenally cool, mean-looking, great switchblade knives. I mean, it turns out they're Rizzuto Estiletto. And as anybody out there knows, that's the crap. That's the bottom of the barrel for switchblades. But when you're 14 years old and you hit that button and that blade flies out, it's like, holy cow, I am the king of the universe. Yeah. If I bring this back and show my buddies, I've just been elevated to premier status. It doesn't get any better. So luckily, my mom and dad were both really cool. And I bought one and my dad said, do you think, they got different sizes and different colors? And I said, I can get more than one. And he says, why not? They're like $6 a piece. So I bought, a half a dozen switchblades, brought them back on the airplane in my lap. I'm flicking the knives in my lap. And my dad said, yeah, maybe you shouldn't do that on the airplane. You think about nowadays and back then. So I said, yeah, okay, I'll put them back in my little carry-on luggage here. But that was what was the beginning of this fascination of knives and switchblades especially.
Yeah, like you said, who can resist that?
Oh.
I mean, even as a grown, officially old guy,
yes,
I love switchblades and out the fronts.
Absolutely,
they're just fascinating, and they're just super cool.
They're super cool. For as much as I like a fixed blade knife and a folding blade knife, when you have a knife that you push a button or activate a lever and the blade comes flying out, it's just your inner being goes, holy cow, is this neat? Right. So, and obviously with all the modern switchblades and all the tacticals and all the stuff that continues to be produced, it's a pretty neat thing. It always has been, I think always will be. So pretty cool.
People find it fascinating, and it's a machine, right?
It is.
Okay.
Even people that aren't really knife people. My neighbor stopped me on my walk to be like, I just got a new knife. And he pulls out a Microtech out the front. He's like, I've just been flicking it when I'm watching TV. I'm like, all right, be careful though.
Yep.
Because of John Wick, man.
Yeah.
John Wick has sold more Microtechs than anybody going.
Yeah.
Yep.
I bet so.
Yeah, for sure. What about Michael, Sean, and Tom? What about your first switchblade? What was the very first switchblade you owned?
Ooh, can I go first? I remember vividly.
All right. Oh, yeah. Vividly. Tell us vividly.
Yeah. We lived in Tennessee at the time, and I lived 35 minutes from Smoky Mountain Knife Works. And, I had my parents take me there whenever I could wrangle it. Next to Smoky Mountain Knife Works, there was a Army-Navy surplus store that had a knife case. And they had these out-the-front automatics marked military with like a little guard and green plastic handle and just, straight push button, little dagger out the front. Wasn't very sharp, but that was my first one. And I got that when I was 11.
Wow.
It was either 11 or 12.
Was it what did you have to, like a Halo where you had to pull it back in against the spring, or did it come back in on its own?
Yeah, button activated, automatically returns.
Both ways, yeah.
Yep.
Nice. I didn't own one of those till much later in life, but yeah, that's fun.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, dude. I thought I was, once again, the coolest cat going.
What about you, Michael?
Mine doesn't quite count because it was the comb version. I got it real young, but man, I thought it was pretty cool. You know what I'm talking about? The novelty one that pops out of the comb?
The comb is the first one I owned as well. And so
me too, if we're going to be technical.
Yeah.
But I'm like, wow, man, when was the next one? What was the second? What was the first real one you owned, Michael?
I've never really owned an automatic.
What?
I've made one. I played with them as, like art knives, but never owned an automatic.
Really?
Yeah.
Dude, that's un-American. Or maybe
Pretty strange.
un-Italian, but whatever. Interesting.
I don't know the why or what of it, though.
About why you've not owned one?
Mm-mm.
Huh. You own some of like the normal
'Cause
knife
you're a
door.
square.
Nope. Take that back. I've got that that one that I got from you, the double action.
The Diskin one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bolster release. So yeah, I do have an automatic.
There you go.
See,
And that-
I'm American.
Whew, that was close.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's a Diskin Fire, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's got a textured carbon handle. It's like a scale release. You slide the scale over and it fires.
But it's almost too much fun, so I don't get it out very often because I know it's got, a shelf life.
Man, that knife
Hard.
fires like an absolute beast. That might be the hardest firing switchblade I've ever owned.
Yeah, it slams home, and I've looked at it, and he's got proprietary screws, so I can't take it apart.
Not
But
by
I wanna-
mistake.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Right. What about you, Tom? First switchblade, first automatic knife.
So I never had one when I was a kid. I had like the fake looking ones that were just like lockbacks, look like an Italian switchblade. But the first one I think I bought and had was probably about 10 or 12 years ago. It was a Microtech UDT 70 with green canvas.
Yeah.
Pretty cool knife. I've still got it. Since then I've bought a few more. Ben went on a Microtech phase. He's still got about a dozen different Microtechs, but I've got, it's bigger than the UDT 70, but it's a little dagger. I can't remember the name of it. And then I got the real wide money clip one that's also a dagger.
Oh yeah, the
Pretty
newer
cool.
one.
These are ones I bought in the last 2 years.
Isn't it called like an Exocet or something like
Yeah,
that?
that's it. Yeah. I've got my Microtechs now are all blue with the black blades. I think they're kind of cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're fun toys. And I mean, they're really well made and they cut great. So why not?
Yeah. I think my favorite Microtech out the front stuff has to be the UTX 70, that little teeny tiny one.
Yeah.
70% scale Ultratech. I love those things. They're just little marvels, right? Because it's like, does this thing actually work? It's so small. Fits in your watch pocket. They're so cool.
They do an amazing job. I mean,
yeah.
the tolerances and the finishes are just amazing.
I think my very first one was, other than the comb thing, I don't think I owned a Switchblade again until I was doing the competitive shooting thing. So that's a bunch of years ago, but I was done with college. And so I was going to gun shows to be able to buy like primers and other stuff. That's where I would source all my component stuff. And so I go to these gun shows with one of my friends, and he was like, "Oh man, you should buy this." And it was a Benchmade. I think it was a Benchmade Pardue auto, maybe. It had aluminum, like blasted aluminum handles.
yeah.
It was quite slim, and it actually had a safety on it, like a little safety switch thing. So if you set the switch, it wouldn't open. Because that's what I was afraid of. That's what I was afraid of. I'm like, man, I don't want this thing firing in my pocket. That'd be awful. Yeah. I'm like, push button seems like a dumb idea, but that one had a lock. I like that.
Was the handle skeletonized?
It wasn't skeletonized. It was definitely fluted. I probably still have it around here somewhere. But that was a really cool little knife. And I thought at the time, I was convinced I did not want a button release because I was afraid it was going to fire in my pocket.
Yeah.
And
you mentioning that makes me remember I actually did have two Benchmade autos from way back in the day.
yeah.
One of them was one of the spikes. You remember those?
Oh, yeah. Yep, Bogey Spike.
Yeah,
Bogazuski.
Benchmade was the only game back then, really.
Yeah.
Which was kind of crazy.
It was really funny. They are today legal in Michigan. At the time, they weren't, unless you were like a first responder, were the only people that were supposed to own them. So I was at this gun show, classic gun show story, right? Where you could buy things at the gun show that you're not supposed to be able to buy. So I'm at the gun show and I'm looking at this knife with my buddy, and the guy goes, yeah, we can only sell those to police and fire people and first responder stuff. I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. And I said, it's a bummer. I'd buy one if I could. And he's like, are you a fireman or a first responder? I'm like, and he just rolled his eyes like crazy. He's like, it's $175, man.
He's like, the answer is yes.
The correct answer is yes. I swear I heard you say it. It's this much money. I'm like, okay. Yeah, it was very funny.
You know, with that said, actually, many of the states in the country have repealed the switchblade bans. Yeah. There's only a handful of states that are still illegal to own, or collect switchblades. It's over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of reversals, which I think has helped to make switchblades more popular also.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah. All right, so we took the long way around the barn, Neil. Sorry, it made me think of it when you said your first one.
It's very cool to hear those stories. So back around 1980, I joined our local North Star Blade Collectors Club in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I was 20, something about that, and I remember seeing some of the first, what I call good quality switchblade charades and cases, and older guys that had these, and I went, holy cow, they make really good switchblades. And then just a couple of years after that, 1982, there was a book that came out called An Introduction to Switchblade Knives. And that was put out by Ben and Lowell Myers. That was a father and son. They were actually, one of them was an attorney, but they wrote this first book on switchblades, and that just opened my eyes. I went, holy cow, there's switchblades from all over the world, and there's these switchblades I've never heard of from England. And I'm looking at these things going, my God, are these incredible? And then they had other, great American switchblades. They had a K-bar Grizzly in there, and the case lever action, and just a bunch of just cool stuff. So that was kind of the beginning. And then after that, there's been probably 10 books on switchblades that have been written since that. I know all the guys that have written them, and they've been great publications, and a lot of guys kind of feed off each other and put more information out, but it's really gone crazy. But anyway, if we get back to the history of the switchblades, no one knows exactly when the first switchblade came out, but we can at least attribute switchblades to the 1830s. And we know that because in England, if you look at some of the old English knives, a lot of the old knives, not a lot of them, the ones that were the better knives would have what they call royal warrant stampings on the blade, like G Crown R, W Crown R, V Crown R, and that was a royal warrant, meaning that the king or queen at the time would say, if you send us your knives, if we think they're worthy, we will grant you a warrant, and we will, kind of say that your knives are accepted by the royalty, which was obviously a huge promotional thing. I mean, and then not a lot of companies got this. Wolstenholme, Rogers, Mappin, some of the big English companies were awarded these rights, but they had to be awfully good. So anyway, there's a couple of switchblades known that have the W Crown R stamping on them, and that dates 1830 to 1837. So that's how we know that switchblades date at least back to that time period. A lot of collectors and a lot of my friends, we kind of speculate that switchblades were around earlier than that. And part of the reason we think that, or we know that, is because, like everything else, everything's always built on something else. Well, where did the switchblade come from? Well, it came from spring-fired bayonet pistols. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen these, but and they date back to the mid-1700s. So they had flintlock pistols. And the whole idea was, okay, you've got a pistol and sometimes even a rifle that you've got a flintlock with one shot. Well, if you're lucky, the thing fires. And if you're luckier yet, you might actually hit what you're aiming at. And then after that, you're done. It takes you quite a bit to reload that, the musket and ball and recheck your flint and all this stuff. So in the meantime, you're being attacked by some guy who's kind of pissed off. He just took a shot at him. So the next best thing is to either draw your sword or your Bowie knife or whatever you have bladed wise. But even better than that, what if you had a little button on the side of your gun that you would pull or push, and a bayonet, flung out, spring fired from underneath or on top of the barrel? And that's what some of these guys had, was a spring-fired bayonet mounted to the bottom, top, or side of the barrel of their pistol, or in some cases even a rifle. So you'd have this kind of backup, cutlery device.
Huh.
And those were actually fairly popular. If you're looking, there's several books. One book is called Blades and Barrels by H. Gordon Frost, and that is like a Bible to guys that are combination weapons collectors that collect anything that has a blade and a barrel. Anyway, those things were popular from the 1750s right up into the 1850s, and right around the 1850s, you started seeing blades instead of bayonets, spring-fired blades on guns. And it was kind of the same idea. Hey, they're still not maybe quite reliable. Let's still have a blade on there. A lot of them were just a manual folding blade, but they also made switchblade variations. One of the most well-known ones was Unwin and Rogers. Unwin and Rogers made some phenomenally great knife pistols back in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, and they made a very few spring-fired switchblade gun pistols, which are just cool as all heck.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's kind of the beginning of the switchblade era, and kind of what led into it was these spring-fired bayonets, spring-fired pistols, and then switchblades.
Were these European guns, or where were these? Who were making these?
These were all of the early bayonets were all European.
Okay.
Probably Belgium, Austria, French. The Unwin and Rogers was English. Pretty much all European, as you suggest.
Okay.
Interesting.
And Americans were way late to the game with switchblades, as they were with knives. I mean, most of the big knife companies, Holley, some of the big American companies, they didn't really start until the mid 1800s, where the English and the Germans and the French, man, they were making, folding knives, pocket knives centuries earlier. So, America was a new country, so they were late to the game on so many things. But bringing up America, George Schrade is kind of considered the grandfather of the American switchblade, and he obviously was. He wasn't the first, though. The first was actually George Corn. I don't know if you guys have heard of a Corn switchblade.
Nope.
They're pretty rare. And they're pretty darn expensive. If you find a Corn switchblade, they bring about $10,000. Wow. Yes, high dollar knives. And you'll see them at gun shows, at like the Blade Show. Do you guys remember Jerry Skelton at all, who used to set up at the Blade Show and a lot of other knife shows kind of in the South there?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he was a big guy, and a great guy. I think he was from Tennessee, but he was one of the guys who had some phenomenal switchblades, and he'd almost always have a Corn, and they were, 10, 12, 14 thou for a Corn switchblade. But Corn was an American inventor who designed the knife back, I think, 1884, if I'm thinking right. But they were actually made in Germany. So George Schrade was the first one to have to actually produce switchblades in America, under his patent, even though they were made by the Walden Knife Company.
Okay.
Trying to dig for a few notes here as I'm spewing all this out. Yeah, 1892, George Schrade came out with the press button knife, and you guys have seen those with the button in the bolster. Yeah. And that was just a phenomenally successful knife. And there again, like I mentioned earlier with Daisy, making something is you're only half there. You have to promote it. And George Schrade, man, what a marketer he was. If you look back through any old hardware catalogs from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, you'll see press button knives in every catalog. And then after that, there was the Schrade Cutlery Company, came after the press button company, and the same thing. George, man, he was pushing that knife everywhere. And a lot of people were rebranding their names on Schrade knives, which was a common thing. Shapley, Remington, Case, all those button knives, they were all made by Schrade, just rebranded as a Case or a Remington.
Was that all done under contract arrangement between Schrade and the companies that were branding them, or were the companies just buying them and branding them on their own?
No, absolutely contract. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Remington, and Case are two good examples. They would have called Schrade and said, hey, give us 1,000, 10,000 of these knives, but just make sure they say Remington and not Schrade. And at that time, nobody knew. I'm sure some guys said, boy, that sure looks like a Schrade, but, it was just common practice. And then talking about Schrade, I think you guys would be so interested to know that, Schrade, he was a brilliant guy. He had so many great inventions. He had he invented a jigging machine for jigging handles. He had a bolster stamping machine. He had heat treating machines. It's so neat to read the history about him because he wasn't just a cutler. He was an inventor. He was a genius. He just did everything. I don't know if any of you guys have seen any of his old patents or any of his old, designs or machinery, but man, he was a genius.
No, I haven't seen that stuff. The patent stuff sounds fascinating though.
It is.
Find that.
Yep. There's a book, and I think it was reprinted. I've got it right here in front of me. It's called George Schrade and His Accomplishments to the Knife Industry. It was published in 1982, and I'm pretty sure that his grandson, Bill Schrade, has reproduced that book. So, and taking that a step further, I don't know if any of you guys have met Bill Schrade. Bill is one of the grandsons of George, and he's a really nice guy. I've met him at a couple shows. The other brothers, the other grandsons, didn't have a big interest in the Schrade company when they were gone by 1958. But Bill kept a strong interest, kept all the tools, kept all the prototype knives, and just recently he reproduced a pole ball Schrade Presto knife. And the pull ball has a little ball on the end of the handle, and when you pull it, it's a real simple mechanism. When you close the blade, a little hook folds over the tip of the blade. So when you pull this pull ball out the back of the handle, it releases that, and then it springs open under, spring pressure. But a cool knife. But Bill just started making these just a few months ago. I've got one in my hand. I bought one from him, and they're just neat as heck. And he did a beautiful job making them. This one that I have has a jig bone handle, really pretty, cool knife.
Yeah, very nice.
Where can we see those?
I don't have his email address, but I think if you just punched up maybe Bill Schrade, Google Bill Schrade knives. I know he has a website, and I apologize for not having that in front of me here, but he's a real enthusiast. I mean, he loves the history and talking about his grandfather, and like I said, I mean, he's when I was at the Mystic Connecticut Knife Show a couple of years back, he set up a huge display of all the prototype knives that George Schrade had. He had all these cool tools. I mean, hammers and small anvils and punches and saws. And I mean, he said, go ahead, pick them up, play with them. And it was just amazing. And so it's fun to see that this legacy kind of lives on in the family. Schrade was actually bought out by Boker in 1956, and they bought him because switchblades were still just popular as all heck. And who would know that 2 years later the U.S. would put a federal ban on switchblades? So Boker took a huge beating. A German company bought Schrade in 1956, and 2 years later folded up the company.
Yeah,
I
remember,
and that was pretty much the end.
I remember you talking about that on the Boker episode, that it was like this, looked like a wonderful idea, and it ended up being a terrible idea. Yeah.
A really bad timing.
Yep. Tom, you got a website, it looks like. What's the website for Bill Schrade knives or William Schrade's work? What?
Yeah, it looks like WilliamSchradeCustomCutlery.com.
That would be it. Yep.
Yeah.
I don't see the knife mechanism you were talking about, but I do find a lot of his work.
He has a knife called the pole ball. It's the only switchblade he has. And Bill, he's made a couple of fixed blade knives over the years.
Yeah, if you go to the showcase of knives tab on his website and scroll down a ways, it's on the left-hand side. Yeah, it looks like a traditional slip joint shape, style kind of thing.
Exactly. If you didn't see that little knob in the end, you would think it was just a traditional folder.
Right. And that hooks on the tip of the knife? Is that what happens?
It hooks on that. There's a little hook that actually goes over the back side of the tip of the blade. So when the knife is closed, that little hook goes over that, and when you, it's kind of ironic, and a lot of us switchblade collectors joke about two-handed switchblades, because the whole idea of a switchblade is that you've got it in your hand, and you've got a rope or a fish or a Gila monster in your other hand, and you don't want to set that thing down to open your knife. So the whole idea of a switchblade is having a one-handed, practical knife to open up with one hand, and then do whatever you have to do. But over the years, there's been an awful lot of knives. The Germans especially have had all these goofy switchblade models that take two hands to operate. And the pole ball is kind of that way. You really have to hold it in your left hand, or if you're right-handed, the other way around, and use the other hand to pull this ball, this little lever back to fire the blade open. It kind of defeats the purpose of the switchblade, but it's still super cool. I mean, it's still, it still has that kick and that clank, and that it gives you that little rush of adrenaline and just super neat.
Yeah. Does it somehow lock in the open position, or it's just spring tension?
It doesn't. It's just spring tension.
Gotcha.
So it acts when it's open, it acts like a slip joint. Yep, exactly.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Oh, I've never seen one of those before.
Yep.
Nice.
Yeah, that's another knife that actually was licensed to Remington. Remington, the original knives, this is larger than what the original ones were. The original ones were pretty small. They were only about 3 inches, and this one's, I think, 4.5, something like that. But the pole ball was kind of a goofy little knife, and Remington sold a lot of them, that were branded Remington, but made by Schrade.
Okay.
So kind of neat.
Yeah.
I got a question for you then.
Absolutely.
I guess I kind of lied about switchblades.
Oh boy, here we go.
Don't we all?
Switchblade confessional.
Yep.
I forgot I had an antique one I got as a kid. I used to do a lot of flea marketing looking for pocket knives. And I've got one that I never was able to tell. It's got a logo with like an arm on it. Like a bicep.
Well, that sure sounds like a Hammer brand, which Hammer brand was an Imperial brand actually, and the Hammer brand was a carryover from the old New York Knife Company, which went defunct back, I don't know, I think in the 1920s. But anyway, Hammer brand and Imperial and Colonial and Edgemaster all made these kind of inexpensive American knives after the war. None of them were around before the war, but they made like these candy stripe. And if you were a kid in the early 50s, you could go to the hardware store and there'd be a card of these things sitting on the counter, and they were like, 59 cents, 89 cents. And they were, like an inexpensive American made switchblade, which there again, any kid would be in heaven to own, way cheaper than a case or a Schrade would have been, and kind of a good introductory switchblade for a kid. Oh, so it sounds like that's what you had.
Yeah. I'm actually, handling it right now. It had like these metal scales that were kind of.
Oh yeah. Yep, they made different variations.
It barely, riveted together type of stuff. It barely wants to.
That's exactly. I can see it in my mind.
So yeah, that was my first.
Good.
I was just searching that when you described it, Michael, and yeah, they, like Neil said, there's a mark that looks like a Arm & Hammer baking soda kind of arm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And up on the tang of the blade. I think I see this candy stripe that you're talking about, Neil. That's pretty wild looking.
Right. They are. They had some kind of cool designs. They had like a toothpick pattern and a regular jack pattern. and different sizes. Most of them they had some little mini ones, and most of them were like in that 3.5, 4-inch range. Most of them were single blade. And they had cool handles. Most of them were what they called the shell wrap, where they weren't they were like tin plate bolsters, and then the liners were just a thin metal, and they'd wrap this piece of celluloid around that and then crip it underneath the handle, and the whole thing was kind of not even riveted together. It had like tabs in the two bolster ends that would like push underneath the liner and kind of hold it in place. You know, a cool idea, but an inexpensive and cheaply made, knife and design.
Yeah.
But boy, they sold a gazillion of those. Holy cow. Back in the 50s from just after the war to 1958, that they were on every hardware store counter in the universe.
Right. Yeah, that logo matches what Michael just sent us. He sent us a little video. Right. It almost looks like yours is missing the scales, Michael.
Yeah, the scales are in the thing. What he just said is exactly what it is. Little tabs on both ends. They don't stay on, but I have them. They pop in. Somebody, of course, ground it, sharpen it a million times. And
right. Yep.
And that little shell wrap was a real thin piece of almost like a piece of plastic. It was celluloid, but it was real thin. So if it got scratched or cracked a little bit, kids or people would just pull it off, and you'd have that bare metal handle, sheet metal handle.
Yeah. The blade on that reminds me of the blade on my grandfather's slip joint, Michael, where it's about an inch too short.
Yep.
Because it's been sharpened so many times.
It's been sharpened so many times.
Yeah.
And the irony is that Arm and Hammer logo, like I said, was used by the New York Knife Company, which was probably the best of all the American knives ever made back in their day. But after the recession, the 1920s, they were out of business, and then Imperial bought their logo and their name. So they went from the most prestigious mark, in America, to one of the cheapest made knives. Imperial sold a ton of knives. I mean, that was kind of your budget knife, and they weren't a bad knife, but everybody knew that was an inexpensive knife to use and carry. And after about your fourth sharpen, if the blade's half gone, you just toss it and go buy another one.
Right. Yeah, they weren't exactly super hard blades, right?
They weren't. Yeah.
These old slip joints, right? That's one thing I always remember about those things is, man, they're like buttery kind of soft.
Yep.
So yeah, lots of twists and turns and before, like I was talking about earlier about Europe, there were so many cool switchblades that came out of all of Europe. Germany had so many neat switchblade knives. We talked a little bit about that with Boker, but Henkel's made switchblades, Bonza, all these companies. And they date back to the 1860s, at least, and probably earlier. France made a lot of really cool switchblades, really beautiful, beautiful switchblades in the mid-1800s. All these guys love the Italian stilettos. I mean, that's really, when you think about what's really hot and always has been hot, has been the Italian stiletto. In reality, I mean, a case, lever action knife, a K-bar grizzly, those were good utilitarian using knives that were, from some of the best companies, best steel, best made. But if you look about what guys really liked, it's like a Ferrari, the flashy one was the Switchblade stiletto. And the ones that are really most collectible are the ones basically from the 1950s. And guys called those the pick locks, meaning that you actually had to take your thumb and push that tab back on the back to unlock the blade and close it. In the 60s, they came out with what they call the Swivel Bolster, which the whole bolster would pivot. And I'm sure all you guys have seen, variations of both these knives. And it was a much better improvement, but in the long run, guys would way rather have the original classic pick locks than the Swivel Bolster. There was a company in the 50s called Latama, and Latama is one of the biggest names, for collectors collecting old switchblades. Well, that name was bought by a good friend of mine named Walter Haluka. Now, he owns the Latama company, and he's been reproducing
Latama knives made in Italy and makes them to an extremely high standard. Again, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that or have ever met him. He sets up at a lot of shows. He's always at the Blade Show. And he has a great reputation, and it's just neat to see that he's reproduced the Swivel Bolster, but also the picklock types. So it's neat to see someone that, is kind of, reproduced retro, versions of classic, beautiful knives.
Yeah, I was going to ask that very thing when you started talking about Italian switchblades. I can't believe there isn't somebody out there reproducing this, like the coolest of the old school stuff, but it sounds like that's actually happening. Can you spell that brand name so people can find it?
Latama is Latama.
Okay.
It's pretty simple, Latama. And if they punch it up again on the website, Walt has a beautiful website. He was a marketing person by trade, so his artwork and his graphics and his designs are just gorgeous.
Yeah, very cool.
But with that said, like I said, most guys kind of associate Italian stilettos with the 50s, but the Italian switchblades actually go back to the 1800s. And there again, through research and writing books and working with other guys, it's been fun to follow the history of the Italian knives, back another 100 years almost. In Italy, there were 3 main regions of cutlery cities, basically. There was Maniago, and that's where all of the traditional stiletto knives were made. Then there was a city called Campobasso, and they made a different type of knife altogether. They also made switchblades. And there was another city called Scarperia, and they made a pattern of knife. It's kind of neat when you look at Europe, how different regions would have their own styles of knives, and when you start looking at them, you go, oh, that's a classic pattern from this region, and France was that way, England to some extent, a lot of guys that would look at even a knife that has a London stamp would say, oh no, that was made in Sheffield and just re-stamped London. So it's kind of fun when you start looking at the history, but also the patterns and styles, and guys start saying, oh, I know where that's from just by the look of it without even looking at a name or a region.
Yeah.
So,
that's pretty cool, the regional flavor aspect of it. That the
Right.
designs came from a certain place around
That's
the world.
right.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Huh.
So, and then other countries, Spain obviously made switchblades. Japan, as far as I know, Japan didn't make any switchblades till after World War II. But after World War II, Japan was so decimated from the war that they were making anything they could to make money. And Japan made a lot of things that had optics. They made binoculars and cameras. But they also made knives. And if you guys remember some of the ads, remember those really kind of cheesy folding camp knives that had 1 million blades, but they were made in Japan? And because you can just about take the main blade and wrap it around your finger. But they're again in Popular Mechanics. And this would have been back in the 50s and 60s, but they sold a gazillion of these kind of inexpensive, camping knives. But Japan was also the one who made these Rizzuto Estilettos. Everybody assumes that was an Italian-made knife because of the name, but it was just a made-up name, and they were all made in Mexico. And a lot of guys have seen, do you guys remember the Mexican bullfighter knives, the lever action knife? Those also were made in Japan. They were a little better made than the Rizzuto Estilettos, but they were a copy of a German lever knife with that little folding lever back and forth on the bolster. And they're again made in Japan. So kind of interesting to see that almost every country in Europe and parts of Asia made switchblades, at some point in time, beyond their traditional knives or folding knives.
Yeah, clearly a long-running demand for switchblades, right?
Absolutely.
Popular for a very, very long time.
Yep, that's right.
I got a question about the mechanics of basically your stilettos and your swing blades and stuff like that. So when you look at like the stilettos, they always have that hole. And I assume that's for, when you close it, that connects, and your button has a lever that pushes in and holds it in.
Exactly. There's a teeter-totter Yeah, if you look at the button, underneath that button, it looks just like a teeter-totter. There's a center pin, a center pivot point, and then a pin that goes into that hole. There's actually 2 holes, one you don't see because when the knife is open, they're generally locked open too. So that pin sits into another hole underneath the bolster.
Okay. So why did they never, I mean, it almost looks like it became like a design feature. You know, they really moved the grind way up, but you never saw them try to like hide it, or it was just kind of part of it, just how they...
Part of it was if you look at the original press button knives, you don't see the hole because the button was in the bolster, which meant the pivot pin was really short. When I look at that, I'm not a maker, but when I look at that, I go, holy cow, how did you guys get the tolerances so fine to have such a short distance on that rocking pin to hold that blade in the closed position? I look at that as kind of a machining marvel. But there are a ton of different mechanisms, and there are a lot of knives, switchblade knives, that you don't see any hole, and there's a lot of knives that don't even use a hole to lock it. One of the famous ones was called a back tab release. And do you guys know Mike Allen, Whiskers Allen?
Yeah.
He made some really cool tab release switchblades. I have one of his knives back in the 80s and 90s. I think he's still making switchblades. I don't know for a fact. But a tab release is the simplest, probably most ingenious design. Basically, on the back spring, there's a little tab attached to the back spring that sticks out that you can put your thumb on. So that tab is attached to the back spring, and that back spring has a little hook that hooks into the back of the blade. So when you push that tab out, you know, the leaf spring just fires that blade open, and there's actually 2 notches in the back of the blade. There's only one hook on the back spring, but there's 2 notches in the blade, one when it's open, one when it's closed. So what a great idea that you know, you can just hold this thing in your hand, take your thumb, push that little tab backwards, the blade flies open and locks. No mechanisms to break, no buttons to accidentally push and go off in your pocket. I'm surprised that more guys haven't made that knife, but it's a great design. And that's been around again for well over 100 years. So the Germans had that back turn of the century, early 1900s. And then Whiskers Allen made a nice rendition of that back, like I said, in the 1980s, 1990s.
I'll have to check that out. That sounds very interesting. I assume it must be tapered a bit, so it, you know, as it wears, it feeds into it. Not
really. When I've looked at them, it's a pretty square joint. I'm sure if you used it a gazillion times, something's got to wear at some point in time. But basically, it's a block that fits into a square, recess in the blade.
Okay.
Huh.
Speaking of that, I thought I'd bring up, as long as we're talking about Mike Allen, when the ban hit in 1958, man, it really killed switchblades, and people were afraid, and there were still people out there carrying him, the bad boys, and people that said "screw you," basically. But switchblades really went underground, and people were afraid of them. Nobody was making them, and then around the late 80s, all of a sudden these new makers started making switchblades. Mike Allen was one of them. Judy Cottage, Butch Vallotton, Charlie Dake, Jim Servin. A lot of these guys I kind of think of as the early custom makers that were pioneers that started to bring this back, in the 80s and 90s. And they made some incredibly cool knives. Dake and Hoskins were making double action knives. Butch Vallotton was making some cool stuff. And then right around that time, I got some other notes here. Right around that time, you guys are aware of the Charlie Oaks black knife,
Yep.
Okay.
Very.
So there's so many stories and rumors around that, but there's been some good information written about that. And Charlie Oaks didn't actually invent that knife. That knife was originally designed by a guy named Ron Miller back in 1987. And he made some prototypes, sold a few knives. I don't think he was the best marketer. He was trying to sell them to the military, and it didn't really pan out. Well, Charlie Charlie Oakes bought some of his knives and then started making his version basically of the same knife. And Charlie, to Charlie's credit, he never claimed that he invented the knife. And I think that he gives credit to Ron Miller saying, hey, this guy designed it, but, I kind of took it from there. And that was kind of the beginning of all of the tactical knives and all of the stuff that came after it, and if you really look at it, places like Boker and Benchmade and Micro Attack and Paragon, these companies were all really ripping off that original, Oakes knife that was Miller knife / Oakes knife that came out in 87, 88. But there again, what a cool thing to see this new thing sprout and then just evolve into all the knives we see today, and all the variations.
Yeah, there definitely were a zillion variations on that theme, right? That was a very iconic design that led to a bunch of stuff. We talked about that knife a little bit, maybe a couple of different episodes.
Yeah.
In some of our, as like an influence kind of thing, right? A knife that kind of drove part of the industry or evolved into something much larger than its original, knife itself.
And I don't know, and again, this would be a question for you knife makers out there, but it seems like this is maybe one of the first knives that all of a sudden the CNC machines are making. And, they talked about that all you need is a guy to basically design a tape or a program to make this thing, and you shove that thing in the CNC machine and it starts spitting out handles left and right. And I'm not sure how the blades were made, if they were, stamped out or what, but it seems like that was kind of another generation evolution of knife making process. And again, I'd ask you guys, were they making CNC knives much before that, much before the late 80s?
I don't know. I mean, somebody was using specialized equipment, but as far as like personal knife makers, like I'd say that'd be fairly rare.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I really don't. But that doesn't mean he didn't pay somebody to have them made or machining,
Yeah. Job shop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I wonder if the Switchblades really hit a resurgence with, once again, wartime. And, that makes it something that soldiers can buy. And then, of course, if soldiers can buy it, then, the American public wants it. And I wonder if that really...
Exactly.
Did that really kind of become a boom when, You
hit the nail on the head, because I think Mark was saying earlier about buying that knife and the guy asking if you're, official
first responder, fireman.
First
yeah, exactly,
responder,
yeah.
right.
Yep.
And that was the case. Guys, these things were leaking out, but they were afraid to sell them. I know that Oakes knife back in, right around 1990, I think they sold like over 1,000 knives to government people, whether they were first responders, firemen, whatever, they were government people. Well, that's exactly what happened, is that people started saying, oh, I want one of these. I want one of these. And so I think that it kind of went nuts from there, and everybody wanted the knives. And I think that, and the more that they went out into the public, I think the more the officials said, let's not even worry about this. We have bombs, and we have chemical weapons, and we have, mass terrorism. I think the last thing we have to worry about is who's got a switchblade. So I think that the public and the government scrutiny really let up, by around 2000. And then after that, like I said earlier, a lot of states started saying this switchblade law is just stupid. We got bigger things to worry about than a switchblade knife.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see some of the modern stuff that's out there. Holy cow. You look at like Kenny Steigerwald, I'm lucky to own one of his knives, and I've seen a lot of his stuff, and it's like, my God, what a work of art. A lot of guys will say, nobody's ever made knives like the Sheffielders did back in the mid 1800s. But I look at some of these custom knife makers, and And I think, holy cow, you guys are as good as these Sheffield knives. And I look at some of the detail work and some of the ornamentation that goes into some of the handles, and I go, my God, are these incredible? And like I said, Kenny Staggerwald is a good example of that.
Oh, absolutely. I'd dare say that Javier Voigt,
Yep.
Man, those things slam hard, and they're just perfect.
Yep.
Right. They have both aspects going, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super crazy deployment, and right, they're also stunning works of art just in general.
Yep. Exactly.
Man, speaking of stunners, I came up on an article you did for Knife Magazine about Switchblade Sabers from the 19th century.
Yeah, that just came out last month.
Yeah, dude, that wicked cool. Talk to us a little bit about that, if you would, because I had no idea there was such a thing.
Those are, they're fairly uncommon. It's like everything else. When you get into a certain world, you find out, holy cow, this is a deep hole. And when you get into, certain groups, like I've been around Switchblades forever, and I got a lot of buddies in this field, and you start seeing things that you would have never seen or heard about it unless you kind of get into this, the core of the group. So I'd seen these Switchblade Sabers, years ago, and, one would pop up here and one would pop up there, and you hold it in your hand and you go, my God, is this a cool piece? And, like I wrote in the article that part of the trouble is with anything that's from the, 1800s on back, there's so little paperwork, so little information. I collect an awful lot of paperwork. I love catalogs and anything that I can get that has information written in it, I try to get. But when you get back past older than 1900, it is harder and harder and harder to find documentation or to find catalogs. By the late 1800s, that's when you barely start to find stuff. So that makes it tough for researchers, especially in cutlery, to find specific information on things. So the cutlery saber, you really have to use, a little guesswork. You have to compare it to other things known from the era, blade shapes, styles. But when you look at these knives, there's no doubt these were made as a forceful weapon. And when I look at it, I think, man, what a cool thing, because you could have tucked this in your pouch, in your belt, in a sash, and you wouldn't have had the cumbersome effect of a sword bouncing around, and if you've got a blade, the only thing better than a folding knife is a fixed blade knife, if you're in some kind of a combat situation. And the only thing better than a fixed blade knife would be a longer fixed blade knife or a sword. So, if you've got something that has a more of a length to it, you've got an edge. So I look at that Switchblade Saber and I go, man, what a cool thing, because, not only does it not take up much room, and not only is it not get in your way when you're running or on a horse or doing anything, you can pull this thing out and with your thumb push that button and this thing flies out, and it's got a huge blade pin, and it's got a huge locking mechanism on the back side. So it turns into this, powerful saber, basically, is what it is when you've got it in your hand. And it's so cool when you fire it. Guys always talk about how switchblades have that cool crack. Well, the Switchblade Saber is more like a Massey Ferguson. It's an old Ford tractor. That blade comes lomping out of there. It's definitely, it's got purpose, but it doesn't come flying out of there like a stiletto. It comes out of there with this enormous amount of torque. And like I said, it locks up solid, and you could chop wood with these things. I'm quite certain they were made during the 1800s. Most of them that I'm aware of were made in Belgium. There is one documented one from Switzerland, and I don't think they were ever issued by the military, but a lot of stuff was never issued to the military. A lot of stuff was what they call private purchase, meaning that a supplier would say, hey, they would go to the PX or go to the commandant or something and say, hey, look, I've got a bunch of these. Will you put them in your PX or in your store, and hopefully guys will buy them. So,
Yeah, almost like spec built stuff.
Exactly. Yep. Private purchase. But I think that a guy that had this, I think was had an upper edge.
So we'll post the picture from the article, the cover picture from the Knife Magazine website.
Sure.
We'll try to post that in the Facebook group so people can see what we're talking about. But,
sure.
So this thing is like basically a break in the center, D-guard saber kind of thing.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
So
D-guard saber. It has a big leaf spring. Another really cool thing is that leaf spring is replaceable. On every model I've seen, there's either one or two screws that hold that spring in place. And that also tells me this was meant to be a utilitarian item. And I'm sure the guys who made these knew that, man, if you're kicking out a blade that big, odds are at some point in time that spring's going to break. So. Right. So they were smart enough to know, hey, these guys are going to be using the heck out of these things, and we want something that can be easily repaired, maybe even in the field. You know, maybe when they bought these, they got an extra spring or two along with them. And there's, like I said, if you look at the pictures in the magazine, you can see that I think they both have two screws. Maybe one has one, I don't remember. But you can just unscrew it, pull that spring out, drop another one in, put the screw back in, and you're good to go again.
Huh.
And like I said, the blade pins on these are incredibly thick diameter, and the lockup on the back, there's a square pin that goes into a big square hole. It is when it's opened up in open position, it feels like a sword. It doesn't feel like a folding knife anymore.
Yeah. So when people have to see the picture to understand, but
yep,
right where the hinge pin is in the center of the length of the blade. So above it on the spine side, there's like a wide piece of steel there, or wider than the breadth of the blade, right? Is that attached to the front part of the blade that moves and it falls into that pocket as it opens, and that's how it stops? Or
no, oddly, it's a little bit like that pull ball we talked about earlier. What happens is that there's a hook that actually hooks over the top part of the blade. There's no hole, there's no pivot pin. It's a teeter-totter mechanism. So when you push that little thumb piece, it rocks this arm with a little hook that's sitting over the top of the blade. So when that hook pulls away from the top of the blade, all of a sudden now it's under spring tension. It's under that leaf spring pressure. Then that blade just comes flying open.
Huh. So that's the release that's right above the hinge pin, or part of the other end of the teeter-totter?
Correct. The other end of the teeter-totter that you see is just a little. It's all one piece, but it's a hook, and it hooks over the back side of the blade. And then this also works like we were talking about earlier about the Italian pick locks. This is also a pick lock. So you have to take your thumb and push that back spring back right next to the pivot pin where the blade meets it.
Huh.
So it's basically a pretty simple mechanism, a rugged, rugged, solid mechanism, a good design, but there aren't, and maybe they made a lot of them, but the survival rate was pretty low. I probably, of all the guys I know, I would be hard pressed to count 12 or 16 of them, known to exist. There is one also in the Smithsonian Institute. I don't know that it's currently on display, but you'll see that in one of Bernard Levine's books that he talks about that. It has a beautiful blade etch on it. And then if you look in that, I know the couple of you guys are kind of book collectors too. If you ever get a chance to get that book, Blades and Barrels by H. Gordon Frost, it's like the coolest book in the universe. It's really old. It was made, I think, back in the 1970s, but it has some of the wildest combination weapons that you just can't believe. But there is one of these Switchblade Sabers in that book that actually has a barrel on top, and it fired a shell as well as firing the blade.
Yeah, I was going to say this shape is visually, that's the first thing that came to my mind is like, boy, this would make a fantastic cut and shoot kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Run a barrel down the top of the spine.
Run a barrel down the top of the spine, and you've got double duty. Yep.
That's an expensive book. I've looked at it a couple
It
times.
is, unfortunately, because they're so long out of print. I mean, $200 would be cheap if you could find one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But they do come up for sale, and that's, if anybody is interested in wild stuff, I just couldn't I couldn't suggest that book strongly enough. It is, if you look through there, you'd never put it down.
I have a copy of that book. There's Lee Lerman, a knife maker, has a knife books Facebook group. I think he started sometime after we have started doing the show.
Yeah.
And it's been kind of a cool place. It doesn't see a lot of traffic, but he shared some of his favorite knife books there. And people that have joined have kind of like, oh, that's really cool. I should go find one of those. Or if someone's looking for a certain book, people help them try to find it. And I don't remember who posted in there, but it was a knife maker, and they talked about that book. And I kind of went on a small quest to find a copy, and actually ended up with a copy.
Good.
I've only thumbed through it a little bit. But yeah, clearly I need to sit down and look through that book a little bit deeper, because it sounds like there's some real treasures in there I haven't hit yet. So
yeah.
Was it Bruce Bump? Because I know he's got one, and
it was Bruce Bump, actually. Yep.
Oh, and Bruce Bump has made so many cool knives. I've only seen them on the internet. I've never met Bruce, and I've never seen his knives in person, but holy cows, he made some neat stuff.
I think that's how Bruce chimed in that group was, hey, you guys, is it like knife books? This is my favorite knife book. They're super hard to find, but check it out. And he showed a couple pages from it and was like, whoa.
Yep. It is wild.
Yeah. Well, this Switchblade Saber thing is definitely really interesting. We'll have to point folks to the article. So it came out in Knife Magazine. Is that right?
It was in Knife Magazine, and there was an issue that just came out last week. So it would have been the issue just before that.
Okay.
So 1 month back.
Okay.
Yep.
And it looks like this thing, the handle, like the end of the blade, the belly part of the blade out at the tip must go through a slot in the D-guard.
Correct.
Rest inside the handle. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. There's a whole big slot inside there. And those blades are big. I mean, it's as you can see from the picture, it's a massive blade.
Yeah.
And that whole thing fits into the handle, and that D-guard is I think it sticks out a little past the D-guard, when it's closed, but the bulk of the blade does fit into there. And then where the long metal handle part extends past the handle, I guess the body part of the thing is pretty thin. Like I said, that would tuck so nicely into a belt. I look at it and I go, what an ingenious thing for any kind of combat guy back in the day.
Yeah. So you mentioned this came out of Belgium for the most part. Any idea why, or how did the Belgians get involved in this kind of design?
Belgium had a long history of weaponry. I mean, Belgium had some phenomenally great guns, swords, knives. They just have a long history of weaponry. So why they made it, I don't know. But that's, most of them marked, like have a Namur was a city in Belgium, and a lot of them have that Namur stamping on there.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I get to Belgium for work on occasion. I'll have to.
There you go. You'll have to go find one.
Yeah, exactly.
They're serious about protecting their chocolates, man.
They are. No kidding. Lose a finger, you don't steal anymore.
There you go.
Right.
All right. Well, fascinating stuff. Neil, so your book on this, it kind of follows a timeline, or does it go down a specific path, or?
Well, I've actually written several books. The book I wrote right after Daisy I wrote a book with two other fellows called The Switchblades of Italy.
Okay.
And there again, it was two good friends of mine. One's passed away, Tim Zinzer, and the other guy is Dan Fuller. And Dan is the most gifted writer I've ever met in my life. He's an English professor at Kent State University. He started there just before the riot. Remember the killings and the riot during the Vietnam War? There's a whole song that I think Creedence did about that.
Neil Young.
Kent State?
Neil Young. Kent State, exactly.
Yep.
So, but anyway, this Dan is just a fascinating guy. He is so cool. He collects pinball machines and hats and loves switchblades, and he specializes in Shakespeare. He's the most eclectic person you'd ever meet. Grew up in North Dakota, out in the boonies, and anyway, this other fellow who's passed away, Tim Zinzer, came to me and said, hey, I want to do a book on switchblades, but I don't know anything about books. And you just wrote this book on Daisy, and I was impressed with that. And we knew each other from the Switchblades. And he said, I kind of want to get my friend Dan involved because he's an English professor and a heck of a writer. And I said, hey, that sounds great. What do you want to do? And Dan, and Tim says, I want to do the history of switchblades. And I go, are you friggin' kidding me? I said, that'd be like a 9,000 volume book. I said, tell you what, how about if we do a book on Italian knives? Because both of those guys the bulk of their collection revolved around Italian knives. And I had quite a few also. And I said, let's start easy. Let's just pick a country. And guys love stilettos. Let's do a book on that. And that book turned out to be another phenomenally great selling book. I didn't publish it. It was published by a company called Turner Publishing. But 20 years later, I still get a royalty check every year, for that book selling. And so we wrote a book just on Italian knives. There again, at that time, the internet was still pretty new. That was in 2003. And, most of our information was stuff that we had on paper or, information contacting people in Italy. It's a good book, but as I look back, I go, holy cow, there's so much more we know now. And that's part of the reason I did that other book on Art of the Switchblade a little later was, I had so much more information, so many more examples. And I think that's the neat thing about all books is I always look at books as being, one book feeds off another book. And I always tell people, man, if you write a book on something that I wrote on, I couldn't be happier. Take what I did and expand on it, run further. So,
right. Yeah. Build on it, right? I mean,
build on it. Exactly. And if you find mistakes, correct them. I'm man enough to say, hey, if I made a mistake somewhere, point it out to me, and you got my pat on the back to you. So, right. Yeah. So I did the Switchblades of Italy, and then in 2012 I wrote that Art of the Switchblade, and that was I just wrote that with that friend of mine, Dan, who's the English professor, and that turned out to be a good book, a nice coffee table book. And we had a lot of good information in there. And then went on to do a few more books after that. So it's been fun. And I don't have to tell you guys, but I don't know what it is about knives. There's something about knives that just draws me in all the time. I love all kinds of other stuff. I love anything mechanical. But there's something about, maybe it's the personality that, when you hold a knife, it becomes part of you. Or maybe it's that a knife is used for so many things. You butter your bread. You guys are, filleting a fish. It's just that it's man's oldest tool. So there's for all the things I've been interested in my life, there's something about knives that just has the strongest draw. Yeah. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah,
yeah, just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Yeah, you guys kind of like knives a little, don't you?
A little.
Skosh.
It's just such a multi-dimensional thing, right?
Yes.
Like you said, it's got huge bandwidth to it. And I think that's been true for farther back than people realize, right?
Oh, absolutely.
That it's not a modern thing that there are very fancy decorative knives and very utilitarian knives, right? I mean, when we had Dr. Rachel Parikh on with us before, and she talked about Asian history around knives, and it goes way, 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 way back, obviously, right? And it's the same thing there where, the stuff that shows up in a lot of museums is the super fancified stuff done for royalty or whatever, but, they're also very rudimentary versions of the same things that did all the work from those same kind of time frames. And so I think that is one of the cool things about it. And like you said, it seems like every time we turn over another rock when we're doing stuff for the show, it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that existed, right? Or I didn't even know someone did that before, or someone made that thing when, that sort of stuff. And I think that's really fascinating and part of our attraction.
And that's the great part about our whole community, is that I feed off of you guys in the same way. When I go to a knife show and see the stuff that you guys have created and the way you've made it. And I listen to you guys talk about these modern metals and all of this mechanical stuff that is not my forte. It fires me up to know more about knives, and it brings up things in the older stuff. I listen to you guys and I think, well, I'm going to take that and apply it to something older and see what I can learn about this. So it's so fun that we all feed off each other, even if we have different interests in the cutlery field.
Yeah, for sure. Michael, Sean, Tom, you guys have other questions on Switchblades before we switch gears to talk BB guns?
I want to know his take on like assisted opening. You know, that we had that 2000s type of hit with assisted open knives.
Oh, yeah.
What were your thoughts on it? Was it like it's a good thing, it's moving towards it, or did you think it was bad because it was moving away from switchblades?
The assisted opening knives?
Yeah.
I think in a way I think they're absolutely cool. I think they're kind of overshadowing switchblades in a way because they have a simpler operation. There's less moving parts. They do the same thing as a switchblade. They open basically as fast. I have a 19-year-old son at home who's got a whole table full of knives scattered across his computer area. And being 19, he likes more of the tacticals and the assisted opening knives. And so I'll be playing with those, you know, with him in the room sometimes going, God, is this cool? Oh, this works so good. Or I'll say something like, well, the action on this isn't as smooth as this one. Or, you know, it takes a different type of leverage on my thumb or finger to operate this. So we'll be comparing like, you know, technical notes. But I don't know. I think they're really neat. I think they're like this kind of weird mutation of a folding knife and a switchblade knife, and probably the best of both.
Yeah. Well, they hit really hard, like your early 2000s to mid 2000s.
They did.
I like in the market, they kind of hit hard. And I didn't know if it was because of the leaking of these automatics that we couldn't get, civilians, you know, quote unquote, couldn't get. And that was kind of filling a void that was, you know, needed, because you don't see them as much anymore.
Really?
You know, I think with everyone doing, you know, flippers that hit just as hard. I don't see them as much, and maybe there's some more out there that I don't see. But and I think that people can access switchblades,
right?
You know, an assisted's like, why go there?
I tend to think of that as a factor. I think that's part of why assisted openers were so popular for a while, was because there's so many states had, you know, laws prohibiting switchblade ownership by regular folks. And so the assisted thing was kind of an end run around it, right? Sort of a cheater version. I think
they were skirting the law.
Yeah. And then,
exactly.
You know, okay, so now a bunch of states, like Neil said early in the show, have repealed it. And it seems like there's a new resurgence as a result, right? Of, oh, okay, now the market's way bigger because people don't have to buy them on the sneaky. They can buy them legitimately, and it's okay. And people that really want them, we're going to have them anyway. But
right.
But the fact that you can buy them, you know, like over the counter or whatever, is pretty cool. And there comes a bunch of demand.
Yep.
I agree with you to a point, Mark. But I think it started to die with the flipper once they actually figured out flippers.
Exactly.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
I think so. I think once that production companies were able to actually make good flippers, it kind of went downhill, because for a while they really didn't have it nailed down. A lot of real weak D10s, stuff like that, and that used to be like, oh, you know, it's a custom because how well it flips. You know, that's obviously not the case anymore.
Right.
You know, and I wasn't even thinking that when you guys brought it up, because you're right. Most of my son's knives are flippers. They're not assisted opening, but they open so fast and so smooth. In my brain, I'm thinking these are assisted opening knives when they're not. They're just incredibly well-designed, fast-acting knives.
Oh, yeah.
Now, one of you guys said you had made a switchblade, right? Didn't I hear that earlier?
Yeah, I'd made an automatic. Oddly enough.
What type of knife did you make? Was it a button and handle, or?
Basically, you could call it a button and a handle. Your same sort of seesaw. You know, I had basically a tab that I made, a pin that went through it, you know, and then of course it had a little block that would go into a drilled out piece in the blade. And of course it had the, I don't know what you want to call it, the spring that's more common. You don't see as many coil springs like we used to see. Remember when remember the Buck when they came out with like turn your Buck into a automatic?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a tangent there, but more of your leaf spring type of thing is what I used. And it was interesting because we weren't able to own automatics, but we can make them in Missouri there for a while.
Huh. That's weird.
Yeah. So yeah, I made one and I was like, that was kind of cool, and never did it again.
Huh.
Do you know where that is?
I have no clue.
Oh no.
I mean, someone bought it and put it away somewhere.
Yeah, it's in the bottom of someone's safe somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
I'm sorry. I mean, it's the gem of someone's collection somewhere.
That's right.
Yeah. Probably Smithsonian or something. I don't know.
Yeah, probably. Rachel's probably got it over there at the collection. All right. Well, very interesting stuff, Neil. I think between those books and a couple of the other ones you mentioned, there's lots of reference material for folks to go dig into if they want to look a little deeper on some of this stuff. That's pretty cool.
And there are so many incredibly cool switchblades that exist out there. If you go onto some of the Facebook groups or go onto some of the forums, there's a forum called Talkblade that is really heavy into switchblades. It's neat to see all the different varieties and variations and styles and uniqueness of the switchblades. So, yeah, I'd encourage anyone that has just a little interest to go check a little further, and you'll say, holy cow, this is deep.
Yeah, it sounds like it. All right. So I think we all probably grew up with the BB gun. I don't know. At least I did. Michael, Sean, Tom, I think you guys all did too, right?
100%.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Used to be a thing, I think, right? And you did obviously as well, Neil.
I absolutely.
Yeah.
I grew up in the suburb, but I'm older than you guys, but back in the 60s, you could sit out in your backyard and shoot pop cans, or leaves, and nobody cared. Don't shoot the neighbor's dog, don't shoot the neighbor's kid,
Right.
But anything else is pretty much fair game.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, all my friends had BB guns. Well, yeah, everybody had a BB gun. It was great. And of course, the BB gun led into the pellet gun, or maybe you jumped right ahead into the 22, and then you're off and running from there. So it's funny, all the shows I've been to, and you'll see the biggest badass burly guys that are talking about their shotguns, and you bring up Daisy and they almost start weeping. Oh, Red Ryder, first gun I ever had. It's fun because, it's just like, that's the beginning for everybody, almost everybody.
Yeah.
And I've got a Red Ryder sitting here.
There you go.
I'm tapping on it.
Yep. Fantastic.
Yeah. So, I mean, you kind of alluded to it in the earlier comments about it, right? Daisy was absolutely a household name.
Daisy was a household name. Now, the problem talking about air guns is even way more, it's a much wider field than switchblades. I mean, if you want to talk about air guns and BB guns, it goes on forever. And there's so many cool stories. Lewis and Clark had an air gun on their expedition. Paul Giffard in France made the first CO2 gun back in the 1880s. There's so many cool stories, but I think maybe we should just stick with Daisy and maybe a few others. And if you guys want to talk about other air gun stuff down the road, there's an endless rabbit hole with that also.
Yeah.
Daisy actually didn't start out making air guns, right?
They did not. Daisy was the Plymouth Windmill Company. So Daisy is a windmill company. It's owned by Lewis Huff. And they're not doing so good. They make these steel windmills, which you think, hey, it's a pretty cool thing because most people were making wooden windmills, and this company happened to be making steel windmills. They're just not selling them very much. So one day in walks this guy, this Clarence Hamilton, and he's got this small steel gun, this rifle. And back in the old days, anybody would make anything. If you had a machine shop and you're making, whatever, gears for something, and someone comes in and says, hey, can you make these skates for my kid? Oh yeah, we'll make anything. I mean, if they were industrious, and if there was a buck to be made, they'd make it. So this Clarence Hamilton walks into the office of Huff and says, hey, I've got this toy gun. Do you have any interest? And Huff says, well, we're a windmill company. What is it? So this Hamilton cocks a gun and drops a BB down the middle and points it at the garbage can and fires it and pops a hole through it. And this Huff supposedly declares, boy, that's a daisy. You know, back then a daisy meant, hey, that's pretty cool. So they talk a little bit, and Huff says, you know, I mean, it's really neat and it's really cool, but that's really not up our alley. We're not set up for marketing on that. And I can see it's going to be kind of a pain to make. He says, I'm probably not interested. So Hamilton leaves, and Huff evidently calls him, you know, a week or so later and says, you know what, I've been thinking about it. And that would probably be a good promotion for our windmills. You know, buy a windmill, get this cool BB gun. So they make up some of these BB guns, and their sales guys take them out, and they come to a farmer and said, hey, we got this great windmill, and if you buy it, you get this cool BB gun. The farmer looks at the BB gun, shoots it a few times, and says, you know what? I'm not so keen on your windmill, but man, would I love to have this BB gun. So it's funny. So all these sales guys are coming back to their boss going, I'm sorry, boss, nobody wants the windmill, but everybody wants the BB gun. So Huff says, well, then I guess we're a BB gun manufacturer now. And they start making these BB guns. And they're pretty cool looking. If you see the early ones, you know, they're all metal. Daisy wasn't the first American company. They were actually beat out a couple of years earlier by a company called Markham. And Markham made this all wooden BB gun, but it was kind of crude looking. The whole thing was wood, and it had a brass barrel down the middle, and it hinged in the middle with a couple of crude hinges. And you know, if you compared the Daisy to this, you'd go, oh man, there's no way I want the Markham. I want this cool Daisy gun. It's all steel and it just looks cool. So they start selling these things, and then like everything else, you know, we were talking earlier, as soon as you make something like that ox knife, all of a sudden there's a gazillion knockoffs. You know, you're the competition, that's America. You know, somebody makes something and it sells, everybody else steps up. So about that same time, then within a couple of years, all these other companies start making air guns, and they make some beautiful guns. There's these cast iron guns and companies like Atlas and Globe and Matchless, and there's a bunch of names. But two problems. One is that sometimes they made guns too good, which means they're more expensive. And Daisy kept their guns a little simpler, a little cheaper. And Daisy made a gun that was always reliable. A lot of these other guns, they'd break. You know, the kids would drop and the cast iron would crack, or, you know, the triggers would wear out, you know, whatever. But the other thing is, like I was talking about earlier, Daisy, they were marketing giants. They came out with a calendar. They paid $2,000 for a bunch of calendars back in right around 1900. And they started, you know, pushing their product that way. And ironically, the company who came out with a BB gun before them, this Markham, Daisy ended up buying them in the early 1900s, and then shortly after just folded the company. So anyway, Daisy was just trouncing the competition left and right. If a new company would come up, Daisy would basically go to their hardware stores or dealers and say, you know, you don't want to carry their brand. You want to carry our brand. And so Daisy just became the absolute reigning king of BB guns.
So Neil, just for the kids at home, $2,000 around 1900 is like $65,000 today.
Huge amount of money.
Yeah.
Huge amount of money.
So the marketing investment was massive.
Massive. And at that time, I remember, you know, I was researching this, and I remember reading different articles about how in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, if a guy made $1,000 in his company, that $1,000 went right in his pocket. Nobody did, for the most part, nobody did advertising, nobody did marketing. That was your profit, and you took the money. Well, Daisy was one of the first companies to start saying, hey, let's get some spokespeople. Let's put some advertising out there. Let's do a calendar. Let's do comic strips. And it just paid off because they got their name out there. And going back to George Schrade, it was the same thing. You can't pick up an old hardware catalog from the late 1800s right up to World War II without seeing George Schrade switchblade knives in there. I mean, they were in every hardware catalog that existed. Sometimes they might be rebranded, you know, Shapley or Remington, but most of the time it was a Schrade, you know, a Schrade push button knife.
Yeah.
So Daisy did the same thing. Daisy just said, man, we're going to market the heck out of this. We're going to put this in every hardware store. We're going to get this gun into the hands of every kid in America. And they did.
So did Daisy also, I mean, okay, so this feels like the Gillette Company question, right? Do you make BB guns with another separate, maybe potentially more profitable revenue stream on making BBs? So like, were the BBs, were they using shot from shotguns for that stuff at the time?
They were in the beginning. Yep.
Okay.
The BBs were basically lead shot early on, and then they transitioned over to copper coated steel BBs. I don't remember what time period, earlier 1900s.
Okay.
But I'm sure there was money in that, but I think, and Daisy eventually had their own branded BBs, but in the beginning, it was all about the guns.
Right. Okay. So somebody else made BBs. That was like a
pretty much
commodity that was not in question.
Especially the early lead shot, because, to make lead shot, they had what they called shot towers back in the old days where, they had these huge towers. I don't know the exact process, but basically they'd be dropping these droplets of, molten lead, and as it would drop down through the sky, it would turn into a ball, and then I think collect into a water tank below. I'm saying a little more than I know, but it was kind of an involved process to make shot. Yeah. So I don't think it was worth. It's kind of like, nowadays you're talking about this big chip shortage. Well, all these companies, car manufacturers, it's like our business isn't making chips, but we sure need the chips. Right. So we got to keep buying them from an aftermarket company that's what they specialize in. That's all they do.
Okay.
And the BBs were kind of the same way.
So Daisy, did they do this smartly, like where the manufacturing was scalable so that they could keep up with the demand that they were in the process of generating, or was there a little inchworming going on with that whole thing?
As far as I know, they absolutely kept up, but I think that the important thing was they kept coming out with new products.
Okay.
I mean, one of the coolest things they had, World War I, the war breaks out. Daisy comes out with a rifle called the Defender with a metal bayonet on the end. I mean, and it would twist and come off like a real rifle. So here you got this gun that looks a little like a military rifle, and you got a bayonet, a steel bayonet with a little rubber tip on the end. First of all, you think, how many kids pulled the rubber tip off of that right off the bat? And then how many moms are going, hey, dear husband, is this really a good idea for a kid to be charging down the street with his Daisy BB gun and a steel, like 6-8-inch bayonet sticking out the end of it? So, but that was it was a big seller. And then right after that, they came out with, again, in the old days, there's a lot of names that people, even I don't really know, but like, Buzz Barton was a teenage cowboy star back in the 20s and 30s. So they hired Buzz to put his name on some of these rifles, like in the early 1930s. And there again, all of a sudden, these kids who are watching all these movies go, that's Buzz Barton, and that's a Daisy BB gun with Buzz Barton's name or logo or brand on the stock. It's like, I got to have that.
Right.
And then right after that, it was Buck Jones. And Buck Jones was another famous cowboy. So there was a lot of cowboys that came before Red Ryder. We always think of the Red Ryder, but, back in our, parents' or grandparents' generation, Daisy was already, pushing the heck out of celebrities and making models that fit those celebrities.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like working all the right kinds of angles, right? Like, okay, cowboy movies, super huge cultural thing. Great. Make cowboy rifles. Wartime, that people always get fired up, right? Tag onto that and let's go make some wartime themed BB guns. That's interesting.
Exactly. That's right.
Huh.
And then in 1939, Daisy comes out with a double barrel BB gun. I mean, there again, you talk about if you're a kid and all of a sudden you get this double barrel BB gun. I can't imagine what would be neater than that. And they were a break barrel, so you'd pull the whole thing down, it would cock, and it had 2 triggers and 2 barrels, so you get basically 2 shots. And amazing, just amazing.
I've never seen one of those before. I'll have to go find the picture.
They were short runs. They made them in 1939, and then again in 1969, I think. But the problem was that the one that was in 1939 was bad timing, World War II. So the gun comes out about a year and a half later, we're into war, which brings up a whole nother kind of cool point about Daisy. I mean, that not only killed the double barrel, but it killed all production of metal guns, because Daisy, like so many other companies, jumped right into the war effort. Daisy started producing, a lot of cool gauges and other metal things, for the war effort. But during that time, they made two all wood guns. They made one called the Chattermatic, and I forget the name of the other one, but one was basically a machine gun that had a little crank on it. So you'd turn this little crank and it'd go rat-tat-tat-tat-tat, like a machine gun. And the other one had a little pump and a cork in the end of it with a string, and it would pop and shoot the cork out. So there again, Daisy was clever enough to say, hey, not only can we not leave the kids without some toys to play with, but we're going to keep our name out there. Even though we're not making BB guns, we're going to keep putting these wooden toys out there so kids keep associating our name with the product, and so the kids still have something to play with. So when the war ended, boom, they're right back into manufacturing, BB guns again, and it takes off like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing that happened, the double barrel came out in 1939. Well, a year after that, the Red Ryder came out. And there again, bad timing because of the war. So there's very few of the original double barrels or first year Red Ryders that came out. But right after the war, they went, Red Ryder became just a huge, what's a bigger name? Red Ryder's like Harley Davidson or Coca-Cola. So that came out, and to this day, they sell them by the gazillions.
Yeah.
I just want to take a second to comment on how beautiful those old daisies are.
Oh, they are.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, the Defender. That's a really beautiful little BB gun.
For a toy gun, they were really well made.
They look it.
It is.
They look robust.
They are. They were. And they were reliable. Like I said earlier, a lot of those early guns had a high percentage of breakage. They were cool, but they didn't hold up. Daisies, man, would hold up. And I don't know about you, we all had daisies. I can't imagine how many million BBs I fired through my gun. It never failed. It never broke. I still have it. It still works. Yeah. So it's like, that's a testament to something. If you can't run it into the ground and destroy it,
Oh, I broke a few.
You have? Oh. Not by hitting them on trees or anything.
We were pretty rough on them.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in Nebraska, and we had Milo fields, and we would shoot Milo through them too. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
We did all sorts of crazy crap.
Yeah.
This, I pulled up a picture of the Model 21 Daisy.
21. Yeah.
And I swear it looks just like my dad's side by side.
It does. It looks just like a shotgun.
Yeah, it's very, very nice.
Yep.
Wow.
They were pretty expensive in their day, and they were also, the original ones were pretty heavy. Another thing, all of the pre-war Daisy guns had blued barrels. The later ones were all painted, but was it Sean who just said a minute ago that they were a good-looking gun?
Yeah.
They were well made. They were pretty, and to have a real blued barrel and, nice maple stocks, and it was a good product.
It looks like these must be kind of like the lever action style, kind of, super ubiquitous Daisy, where there's an outer shroud, right, with an end cap that centers a thin barrel that's trapped inside.
Daisy had a couple different mechanisms on the, if you guys remember, the pump action guns, model 25. There's so many models I get confused. But anyway, that one and the double barrels, you would actually unscrew that end. There's a knurled end on that barrel. You unscrew that and pull that out, and there's this inner tube, and you would fill that inner tube full of BBs. So it would hold like maybe, 30 BBs per tube. On the Red Ryders and the lever action guns, you wouldn't unscrew anything. You just turn the end and a little port would open up, and you'd pour in anywhere from 500 to 1,000 BBs. and they would just, basically funnel into the loading port every time you cocked the gun, holding it upward. So they had a couple different types of mechanisms in their guns, but the double barrel was totally different than like a Red Ryder as far as loading it and the mechanism.
So the double barrel loaded from the end, and then when it broke, that cocked the gun, but you didn't actually load it from the breech. It loaded itself.
Nope. It loaded itself, and it would hold each one of those barrels. Like I said, would hold roughly 30 BBs each.
Yeah.
And it was a little cumbersome. The nice thing about the Red Ryder is that you could, if you had like a little funnel or a little scoop or something, I mean, you could just pour those BBs into that tube, in a matter of, 2 minutes. So if, you're shooting machine gun style, you got to load them fast.
Heck
so
yeah.
So the pump action gun and the double barrels were a little more cumbersome, took more work to load. At least you'd get your 30 shots, or so, but it did take longer to reload them.
Yeah. I swear I know I'm not alone. I probably dumped twice as many BBs on the ground.
Oh, absolutely.
Trying to fill that goofy side port on my Daisy.
Yeah, we all did, right?
Yeah, it's like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. I'm like throwing these away. They're like flying everywhere.
Yep.
Even with that little milk carton.
The milk cartons were great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The milk cartons were great. You're right.
I still managed to dump them everywhere. I remember my dad getting on me. He's like, we just bought those. What are you doing? I'm like, I can't, they won't go in. I don't know. I do remember using a funnel, but I think I got yelled at for using the funnel out of the kitchen or something.
Yeah.
But like you said, man, so many BBs through that thing. And same thing, I still have it. It's sitting here in my little hallway entry closet as the non-lethal option for, because you could see the BB arc out the end of the barrel.
Yeah.
Right? It's the non-lethal
the mild
option.
Annoyance option. Is that
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And then Daisy came out with some BB pistols in 1937. And they were a pretty good sell, but they were always more into rifles. I mean, that was their thing. But with that said, Daisy had some really cool toy guns. I mean, they had, like I said, metal squirt guns dating back to 1915. And those things were great. I've got several of them, and basically you'd put the barrel in water and pull the cocking mechanism back a couple times, and it would suck the water in, and then when you pulled the trigger, it scored every bit as any modern squirt gun would. Not like a super soaker, but like any modern trigger fired squirt gun. And they made so many cool other toys, all kinds of cork guns and dart guns and wild colors and cool designs. And it would have been fun just to see their design department of these guys just having fun designing this creative stuff. And then the 1960s hits, and all of a sudden we have the space generation. So they're doing, the Buck Rogers, the space people. And it's kind of neat because the cowboy stuff is still super strong in the 1960s, but so was the astronaut stuff. So you see a lot of this rocket themed, stuff. You'll see like, the Daisy rocket dart shooter, and there'd be a picture of a rocket, embossed into the gun itself. And neat promotional stuff, neat advertising, clever marketing.
I had never seen these Daisy squirt guns. I guess I had, because the Buck Rogers thing looks like, I don't know, maybe it looks like every toy Buck Rogers gun from that era. But yeah, that probably was, it's maybe a little too early, but like the Squirt-O-Matic.
Oh, Squirt-O-Matic, yep, absolutely.
Is a shape that is kind of like right on the fringe of that space. You know what I mean? Like it's not colorful like a ray gun would be, but boy, it's got that kind of shape going on.
Right.
Minimalist, Oh, that's really cool.
Probably my favorite toy gun of that period was called the Buck Rogers Liquid Helium Water Pistol.
Look at her picture.
Liquid Helium. And it's this cool, bulbous, it's a stamped metal gun, and it's all lithographed in bright yellow and red, and it's got Buck Rogers on there and that name on there, and you look at that and you go, oh man, there again, what kid had that? Was just like, he'd incinerate his buddies if he hit them. It's like you don't want to be shot by that gun because you instantly evaporate. Anything labeled liquid helium water pistol,
Yeah. 25th century, no less.
Yep.
And so you'd stick the muzzle in a bucket and pull back that D-ring or
that's right. That one had a D-ring. You'd pull back. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that would just, cock it and shoot.
How cool. The packaging is gorgeous too.
It is.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then, unfortunately, like so many things after the war, they had to make things cheaper. So it's kind of sad that even though daisies are still cool after World War II, they had gone to painted barrels instead of blued. Stocks all of a sudden are plastic instead of wood. And a lot of them were still neat. The Red Riders basically still kept mostly wood stocks, but the bulk of other guns went to, like I said, painted metal parts and plastic stock and forearm parts. So most of the collectors tend to collect what they call the Plymouth, Michigan, which is the pre-war stuff. But like everything else, the newer stuff is still becoming collectible too. You ever listen to your parents or grandparents talk about antiques and they say, that antique is what I had when I was a kid. So it's hard when you think that something's already gone 30, 40, 50 years and maybe you played with that and all of a sudden new generation says, oh, what a cool old thing. And you go,
right.
Old?
Yeah. It can start to feel a little personal.
It does.
Yeah. So this was a Michigan company. Was that from its inception or did they move
Plymouth,
around?
Michigan, and then they moved to Rogers, Arkansas. I don't have the date in front of me. Sometime in the 60s, I think.
Okay.
And they got bought out a couple of years ago, I think, by a company out of Italy. Most of the stuff that I'm into, I'm more into older things, more history. So there's a lot of stuff, even with the modern switchblades. I know some of the makers and I know some of the current stuff, but it's not my strong suit. So there's cool stuff, but I'm kind of trapped in an older world.
It moved to Rogers in 1958.
Okay, there you go.
Which is only like 20 some miles away from me.
There you go.
I was going to say, they moved from my neighborhood because Plymouth's not far from here. So from my neighborhood to Tom's neighborhood.
There you go. And Tom, I've never been there, but I believe they have a pretty nice museum.
They do. Yeah.
So,
have
you been there?
I haven't. My family's all been there.
Okay.
But I've been pretty much into modern air guns quite a bit, but one of my friends, Guy Brawler, who did all the machining for Bob Dozier, like the Dozier grinders, he did all the machining and all that kind of stuff. He was actually one of the machinists at the Daisy plant for a long time. Wow. So I got a bunch of books from him and manuals and all sorts of crazy stuff because they shut down. And then I think they've opened another place here in town, but it's much less than what it was.
You mentioned modern air guns, and there's another field that has just gone bananas. I mean, see some of the designs, and I think most people aren't aware of how good and how powerful some of these modern air guns are. They call them the pre-charged, as you know. And I mean, some of these guns can shoot 30 to 50 caliber at 850 feet per second. I mean, they're absolutely matching, rifles. Ballistic rifles.
Well, it's you're matching pistol cartridges basically out of air rifles.
Yeah. You're right. Yep.
That's a whole deep rabbit hole, and I think Robert Beeman is the to be credited with the modern air gun revival, and that started in the 80s. And
he had an awful lot to do with it. Exactly. Yep.
Him and Tom Gaylord, I think, were two of the bigger people in it, and I worked for A.G. Russell, it was probably in the early 90s, 90, 91. And during the time, they had a catalog called the A.G. Russell Gentleman's or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't remember. But I recommended the 499, the Daisy 499, and they started selling those because it was kind of cool. They were made here. It was an Arkansas company, and this was the most accurate air gun. It was
Exactly.
how it was built, and they sold hundreds of those. They sold great, and it was it still is a relatively inexpensive rifle, and it's a great way to teach marksmanship to new shooters.
Absolutely. I think that was big in the scouting program, and you're right. I think that was a phenomenally great teaching tool for kids.
Boy, this is pretty wild. I just happened to glance at my email, and somebody must be monitoring the show, because one email I got is from Grant and Gavin Hawk, who are way into the modern automatic thing, and and an email from A.G. Russell where Goldie talks about assisted opening knives. I'm like, what the heck?
No kidding.
Getting an on-topic email while we're recording live.
This modern technology. How do these guys even know that? Do you have people that can listen to the show as it's being recorded?
No, but
yeah,
I'm sure it's my Amazon Alexa or Siri or somebody passing on.
Oh, okay. Somebody's spying on you.
No, I just thought it was a funny coincidence. That's pretty cool. Tom, did you send this link because I mentioned this before? The 499B?
No, that's the one that I recommended A.G. Russell sell. It's a great gun.
How long ago did you recommend that?
That would have been 91 or so, 90, 91.
Okay.
They've sold hundreds and hundreds and hundreds.
I know. Yep.
Wasn't the 499B, was this the youth marksmanship gun, or was it a...
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So I was going to say,
they're such a cool gun. They basically are a muzzle loader.
Yeah, it's a muzzle loader, lever action.
The sights are great.
Sights are great. Yep, you had interchangeable front sights in that front little tube piece, and pretty for a BB gun, pretty darn accurate. I mean, inherently BBs are not very accurate. Compared to a pellet gun, they tend to kind of move around a lot in the wind. But that gun was pretty accurate.
Didn't they recommend shooting a precision lead shot out of these? I think so. Seems like they had special ammo for them. I know that.
They did have match grade BBs. I don't know much more than that.
I know what you're talking about, Tom, because I have one of these somewhere in the basement.
Pretty sure they were lead, maybe. Maybe they were precision steel. I can't remember. But it's been 20, 30 years.
For some reason, I think it's steel, because I have one of these, and I don't even remember how I came to own it. I didn't just order it online. I called somebody or wrote to somebody. Maybe it was somebody at Daisy. But there was like a youth marksmanship thing that involved these guns, and I wanted to get something for my son, and I thought, that'd be really fun. I don't remember exactly how that story evolved, but I know I have one because I remember the whole interchangeable front sight and, the special peep in the back. Yeah, cool.
I've had several of the 753s also over the years, the single-stroke pneumatic Daisy match guns, and they're fun too.
Yeah. Match guns are another wild thing. I mean, talk about the most accurate, gun in the universe. I mean, the Olympics have the 10-meter shooting. Yeah. I've done a little bit of that over time, and it is wild. And you see these guys putting pellet inside a pellet at 10 meters just over and over and over again. I mean, actually, they're using a different target for every shot, but basically that pellet is dead center, dead center, dead center. It's just, you go, holy cow.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of them actually have like paper that runs in the back, spools, and you have to count the holes to make sure.
Right.
Crazy.
Yep.
But yeah, modern air guns are, I actually had a air gun forum for a while. I shut it down, but they're...
Did you head yourself?
Yeah.
Oh, you're kidding.
Pellet Head Network.
It's
all gone now.
I know. Yep.
Very cool.
I shot field target shooting for quite a few years, about 20 years ago, and that was fun, setting up these steel knockdown targets out in the woods. And
what'd you shoot?
I was a few guys that held on to a spring gun. I shot a gun called a Whizcom, John Whizcom out of England.
Yeah.
Those are the dual cylinders. They recoil opposite.
Yep. It's either a 2 or 3 cock version. This guy handmade these guns, one at a time in England. And just a work of art. I guess it's the old guy in me thinking that I don't want to have to haul an air tank or a pump to charge my gun. I want something that if I'm out in the woods, I can cock it and shoot it. And most all my buddies, we all started out with spring guns, shooting, BSAs or different spring guns. And the PCP started coming out in the 90s, and a lot of guys are converting over. And I ordered this Whizcom and kept shooting with that, and a great gun. But like I said, I just wanted something that was still self-sufficient. I realize these PCP guns are amazing, but you still need either that scuba tank or a really high compression pump to go with you to fill these things.
Yeah,
Yep.
my favorite guns. So I've got probably at least 15 or 20 pre-charged guns. And
Oh, no
everything
kidding.
From 17 caliber all the way up to 30 and 45 caliber.
Yep.
But
Wow.
my favorite guns are the tuned old school Beemans that I've got quite a few of them that I've had extensively tuned and new stocks built and everything. And I've got a couple 20 calibers, and they're just great to shoot. A properly tuned spring gun is my favorite.
Oh, yeah.
Anyways, that's a rabbit hole we can go down forever.
It is another rabbit hole. You'll have to have another show because, it's... oh, man.
Well, thanks for taking us down the path on that, Neil. That was really
No.
interesting. There's some stuff in there that I didn't even know existed.
Oh, man, my pleasure. It's always fun to talk with you guys.
Yeah.
All of our hobbies all kind of intersect and interweave, so...
It seems absolutely to be the case. Yeah.
Yep.
It's not uncommon to talk to another knife person, and it turns out you have 5 or 10 or 20 other hobbies
Oh, absolutely.
in common. Yeah.
Cars, motorcycles, pocket watches, guns, trains. It does. It goes on and on and on. And what a great thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. All right. Well, Michael, Sean, Tom, you guys got anything else before we wrap this thing up?
I don't think so. That was a fun talk.
Yeah.
Educational for me, for sure. So we definitely have to thank our Patreon supporters. Those folks stick with us for a long, long time running now. We've got a pretty solid following of them. So high five to all the folks out there that send us a few bucks each month to help keep the show going. Listener support, and we appreciate you. So thanks for sticking with us. And George from American Metal Exchange. George is awesome. And Neil, thanks again for taking the time. Much appreciated.
Man, thank you guys.
And thanks everybody at home for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Neil, and take care, folks.
To learn more about our makers, you can find Tom Crine on the web at crineknives.net, in his Facebook group, Crine Knives, or in his Instagram account, at Crine Knives. For Michael Birch, check birchtreeblades.com, Facebook group Birch Tree Blade Works, or Michael's Instagram at birchtreeblades. For myself and the Raygun Bead Project, we're on the web at raygundivision.com. We have a Facebook group called Raygun Division, or my personal Instagram at msteiner. For those interested in photos, references from the show, or some discussion about the show itself, you can find us on the web at markofthemaker.com, in a Facebook group called Mark of the Maker, or on our Instagram at Mark of the Maker. Last but not least, the ultra cool and haunting background music we use for the show is a piece called Noir Guitar by Stevie's Amp Shack, found at the Free Music Archive and licensed under Creative Commons CC BY 4.0. Thanks for listening.